Now let's take a look at how to build a news site layout using Flexbox as well as Grid. Before we do that, let's take a look at what the final layout is going to look like. So on a large screen, this is a typical news site layout with a header and a sidebar on the right containing news in brief, weather, sports, and perhaps some advertisements. On the left-hand side, you've got the main news content, and each news item is displayed in a single card. And the cards can be different sizes. So up here, you can see the cover story, and the cover story spans the entire content area. But as you scroll down, you see there are smaller cards, each of which is 50% of the content area. If you scroll further down, you see even smaller cards, which are about 33% of the content area. And at the very bottom of the page, you see 3 columns containing links to various other sections of the newspaper. This is on the desktop. As you decrease the width of the page, everything collapses into a single column view, with the header appearing at the top, followed by all the news items, all the news cards, further followed by all the news in brief, the weather, sports, and finally the bottommost section of the newspaper, which contains all the links. So let's start building this. Let's first create our base CSS. I'm going to call it nwbase.css. And now let's create a directory for the Flexbox version. I'm going to add a file called index. All right, so let's create an HTML file. Call it index. I'm going to call it the CSS times. Let's add the viewport meta tag. Initial scale is 1. And let's add a reference to our base CSS file, wbase.css. And let's start writing the body markup. So I'm going to create a div called container, within which I'm going to create another div called header. And you might notice that this markup is not semantic, but for the purpose of this demonstration, let's just go with divs. I'm going to add a header. I'm going to add some body content. And I'm going to add a footer. And I'm also going to add a sidebar. Now, within the content, I'm going to add a bunch of news stories. I'll call it NW story. And a news story is going to contain an image and I'm going to use a kitten image again, which is wider than it is high. And each story is going to have a body, which will have another heading, followed by a paragraph of text. So this is what our news story looks like. The sidebar is similarly going to be filled with a bunch of news stories. and the footer is going to contain a bunch of bottom nav divs, each one of which represents a single column of links. And let's see what the content is. All right, so we're going to have a header followed by an unordered list of links. So this is a general idea of the markup of the page. I'm going to fill this page with a bunch of dummy data. So now I've populated this page with a bunch of dummy data, and let's see what this looks like on the page. So this is a bunch of unstyled content. This is our header. These are our stories. And we've got the sidebar right here. And we've got the bottom bar, the footer bar right here. So everything pretty much runs together. Let's start styling this one by one. Let's begin by writing some base CSS, beginning with our box sizing rules. So HTML has border box, and every other element, including every other pseudo element, inherits the box sizing rule. I'm going to give the body a font family of serif, a font size of 16 pixels, a line height of about 1.5, and a background color of silver. So this is what everything looks now. Let's give each story a background color of white, so it's easier to see what the layout looks like. See? Great. Let's also give our header as well as our footer a background color of white. So now we have a card-like layout with our header, a bunch of stories, and the sidebar, the footer, everything with white backgrounds. Let's decrease our screen size so we can start building the mobile version of the layout. Refresh this. Let's give our story bodies some padding, perhaps 1 rem. Let's give our images a max width of 100% of their containers, so they don't overflow to the side. And finally, let's start building our Flexbox version of the website. We call it nwflex.css, and we're going to begin by writing a media query for the mobile version. So max width is going to be 900 pixels, and we're going to say that our NW container is a Flexbox container. Let's refresh this. Nothing changes at all. Let's add a bit of a margin between these story cards. A margin of 1 rem. And reset the margin on the bottommost child. So now let's refresh our layout. We forgot to pull our style sheet into our page, so let's do that now. And look at this. All right, so because the default direction for the Flexbox layout is horizontal, not vertical, we need to go back into our CSS and change our flex direction and say flex direction column. Now let's see what happens. All right, so we have everything laid out in a single column from top to bottom. Now let's add some margin to the header as well. And let's center everything inside the header. And for this, we can just use text align center because our header doesn't have a vertical height, so we don't need to size it vertically or align anything vertically. So now our layout is looking similar to our reference layout. Let's scroll down to the bottom and style our footer. Before we do that, let's add this margin to the sidebar as well. We actually don't need these rules because there's only one header and one sidebar. Now let's refresh. Our spacing is correct. Yeah. Okay, so now let's start styling our footer. Let's begin by styling the list and saying let's style as none. And our padding is going to be 0. Let's see what that gives us. Something like this. And then we need to declare our footer as a Flexbox container. Our flex direction is going to be row. And we can omit this because that's the default. And let's see what happens. All right, but everything is too close together. Everything is jammed together too much. So let's add some space between. I'm going to say justify content space between. So justify content redistributes space along the Flexbox axis. And one of the possible values for this is space between, which distributes space in a way that all the remaining space is equally distributed in between of all the Flexbox elements. So doing something like this gives us the sidebar we want. Let's add a little bit of padding to the left and the right. And that looks pretty good. So now let's move on to building the desktop version of this layout. Let's make our browser larger and refresh. And the layout looks exactly the same on the large screen as well. Let's start by moving the sidebar to the right and the content area to the left. Let's write a media query. Within this, we're going to say NW container display flex and we want everything to wrap in this case. So let's see. Right. Now, let's begin by getting this header to span the entire length of the screen. There we have it. And let's have NW content take up about 2/3 of the screen and NW sidebar take up about 1/3 of the screen. Let's see what happens. But our footer is now jammed up against our sidebar. So we're going to say NW footer also has a width of 100%, which will push it down. Great. We need some space between the sidebar and the main content, so I'm just going to add a right margin to the main content. Say 1 rem. Refresh this. And now let's add a bottom margin. All right, so now let's look at the page. There seems to be a missing bottom margin here. So let's go back to our code and let's just give every single story a bottom margin of 1 rem. This fixes the problem. And because margins collapse, looks like the margin of the story is being added to the margin of the sidebar. So we can just get rid of the margin on the sidebar and let the final story handle this bit of spacing. All right, back to the big screen layout. Let's add some padding to the main content. Let's add the padding to the content as well as the sidebar. No, this still doesn't give us what we need. Let's give the content a margin left of 1 rem, and let's give the sidebar margin right of 1 rem. This should give us some space on the sides. Yeah. And the footer as well as the header span the entire page. All right, so now we have this basic layout going. Now we want to do something more interesting with these story cards in between. We don't want them to be arranged one after the other, spanning the entire width of the content area. So let's do something interesting with these. To begin with, let's declare the content area as a flex container. And we're going to say flex wrap is wrap. Then let's see what happens. All right, this gave us absolutely nothing, but let's define some extra classes on some of our stories. Let's see. So let this story be a large story. Let's just let this story cover, the first one cover the entire width of the content area. And the second story can perhaps be a smaller story. And so can the third story. And now we're going to add some styling for these classes, NW story half. And their width is going to be 50% of their container element. Let's see what that gives us. Here we are. Now the two stories are placed right next to each other. Let's give them some margin. We're going to say if an NW story half appears after another NW story half, it's going to have a margin left of 1 rem. See what that gives us. Now our stories are kind of arranged strangely, so we're going to have to play with these values here to get them to line up. And this is something you'll just have to experiment with to get the right amount of the right width. All right, so we have approximately the right width, except there's a tiny bit of misalignment here, which we can fix by saying justifies content space between. And there you have it. Now let's make the following 3 stories even smaller. What I'm going to do is call this NW story third, NW story third, and one final NW story third. And in my code, I'm going to say NW story third is about 33% of its container. Let's refresh, and there we have it. A large cover story, followed by 2 smaller stories, followed by 3 really small stories. Let's add a little bit of margin between these so that the gutter size is maintained throughout. We can just club this with this rule, NW story third plus NW story third has a margin left of 1 rem. Now this is going to mess up the layout again, and once again we'll have to play with this value to figure out how wide one story needs to be. And this feels a little hacky, but this is the least bad way of doing it with Flexbox. This is the least bad way of building this grid using Flexbox. So let's see what we've built so far. We have our header. We have a sidebar with a bunch of stories. We have our main area, which has a cover story, 2 smaller stories, and then 3 even smaller stories, followed by 1 large story again. And at the very bottom, we have this footer spanning the entire width of the page with 3 columns. Let's see what we get on mobile. So if we make this smaller, everything collapses into a single column, which is what our reference layout also looks like.